A guard walks the cell block at Alcatraz, doing the same head count he's done 1,000 times before. He stops at cell 138. Frank Morris is asleep, turned toward the wall, same as always. The guard moves on. 2 cells down, John Anglin is asleep too. So is his brother, Clarence, right beside him. Everything looks normal. Nothing is normal, because the men the guard just counted aren't men at all. Their heads built from soap, toothpaste, cement dust, and real human hair, painted to match human skin, tucked into beds under blankets pulled up just far enough to fool a tired man doing his 200th walk of the week. The real Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin are gone. They've been gone for hours. And by the time anyone realizes it, by the time alarms start ringing across the most secure prison in the United States of America, the 3 men could already be a mile out into freezing, black water, paddling toward a coastline where no one from Alcatraz has ever, not once, arrived alive. This is the story of the only escape from Alcatraz that might have actually worked. And more than 60 years later, the U.S. government still hasn't closed the case. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how 3 men broke out of a prison the U.S. government built specifically to be inescapable, using tools you could find in a kitchen drawer. You'll learn why the 4th man in their plan never made it out, and why that failure is actually the reason we know this story at all. And you'll see the real evidence, the letters, the photograph, the 2025 recreation, that has investigators, historians, and true crime obsessives still arguing about one question nobody has ever definitively answered. Did they drown that night? Or did they win? Let's start with the place that was never supposed to lose anyone. Alcatraz sits alone in San Francisco Bay, about 1.5 miles from shore. The name comes from an old Spanish word for pelican, the birds that used to be the island's only residence before the U.S. government turned it into a fortress. In 1934, at the height of America's war on organized crime, Alcatraz was converted into the most secure federal penitentiary in the country. This wasn't a place you were sent for a first offense. This was where the government put the men other prisons couldn't hold. Men with a history of violence and a history of escaping. Al Capone was here. So was George Machine Gun Kelly. So was the man known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. The prison was designed around one brutal advantage: the water. Even if you got past the guards, past the walls, past the wire, you still had to survive over 1 mile of some of the coldest, most violent currents on the West Coast. Officials didn't just rely on concrete and steel to keep men inside. They relied on the ocean doing the job for them. For 29 years, it worked. Every attempted escape from Alcatraz ended the same way: recapture, or a body that was never found, presumed drowned by a bay that didn't care how badly you wanted to live. By 1960, that record had made Alcatraz something close to a myth. A place where hope wasn't just discouraged. It was statistically pointless. Frank Morris didn't care about statistics. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960. He'd been orphaned at 11 years old, bounced through foster homes, and committed his first crime at 13. By the time he reached Alcatraz, his record included bank robbery, burglary, and drug charges, plus something the prison system found far more concerning than any single crime: a pattern of escaping. He'd already broken out of another prison once before, and he was smart. Testing at the time measured his IQ at 133, high enough to be considered borderline genius. Prison officials knew this, and they still couldn't stop what was coming, because intelligence like that doesn't show up on a security checklist. Later that year, another inmate arrived, John Anglin. And a few months after that, his younger brother Clarence followed him in. The Anglins were nothing like Morris on paper. They were two of 14 children from a poor farming family in Georgia, with a long record of burglary rather than sophisticated crime. But Morris and the Anglin brothers had already crossed paths in prison systems in Georgia and Florida years earlier. When they ended up in adjoining cells at Alcatraz, they didn't need an introduction. They needed a plan. A fourth man joined them, Alan West, already serving time for car theft and a prior failed escape attempt at another prison. West would turn out to be the most important source we have for understanding exactly what happened next, because he's the one member of the group who never made it out. Starting in December 1961, the four men began the slowest, most patient jailbreak in American prison history. Here's the detail most people get wrong when they picture a prison escape. They imagine one desperate night, a single burst of chaos. This wasn't that. This was 6 months of controlled, disciplined, nearly silent engineering, carried out a few feet from armed guards, inside cells built specifically to make this kind of thing impossible. Behind each of their cells was a ventilation grate leading to an unused utility corridor. The concrete around those grates was old, slightly weakened, and Morris noticed it. Using stolen spoons, sharpened against the cell floor, and a homemade drill improvised from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor, the men began working the concrete loose, grain by grain, night after night. Every session ran from 5:30 to 9 p.m., prime evening hours, when the cell block was loud enough to provide cover, but guards were still making rounds. One man dug, one man kept watch, and Morris played the accordion. It sounds almost absurd, but it's true. Morris practiced the instrument most evenings, and the sound masked the scraping and grinding coming from inside the walls. Guards walking past heard music. They didn't hear four men slowly carving their way to freedom. As the holes grew large enough to become visible, the men covered them with cardboard, painted to match the cell wall, removable in seconds and invisible at a glance. Piece by piece, cell by cell, they broke through into the corridor behind them, a corridor that led, eventually, all the way up. 6 months. Night after night, just a few feet from armed guards, they slowly built a way out of Alcatraz. By the end of it, the tunnel was finally ready. But the tunnel wasn't the hardest part of the escape. What they left behind inside their cells would fool the guards and become one of the greatest prison deceptions in history. We'll reveal that in part 2. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to Varric so you don't miss the next chapter.